I'll outline basically the core kind of vibe of what's going on with the big beautiful bill, and then there's a lot of different angles to talk about. So at its core, this is a reconciliation bill. We can come back to that later, but that's less, I think, important than our Congress is voting on a giant bill that's going to affect a bunch of budget things. In fact, it has to affect budget things to even exist. Unlike a lot of other bills, this only needs a majority in the House and the Senate. Meaning it's just 51 people in the Senate. Usually, for people who are not aware of American politics, you need 60 votes in the Senate. That's not the case here. And then right now, Republicans have the majority in the House and Senate, so that they can just get the Republicans on board. They're good to go. So what exactly are they trying to do? They're trying to pass a bill that's going to change spending. If you pull this up, Perry, here's a nice, simple chart. And this actually is like...
Can you describe it for audio people? Just like a basic overview?
It's just showing that what the bill is going to do is instead of reducing spending because we're way the fuck in debt, we're increasing it. This is going to actually has a bunch of costs to the government. This chart is a little misleading because spending and income, these are all estimates, by the way, largely by the Congressional Budget Office, which are change a lot based on different factors. But this is basically just giving you a rough idea in terms of trillions. The estimate from the CBO is over 10 years, which is the timeline that I think is easiest to think about. It's going to add about 3.8 trillion to our debt. So
I also want to jump in and clarify.
That's the low end even. Yeah.
Clarify one thing. The 60 vote requirement in the Senate, from my understanding, is because we have gotten so used to using the filibuster in the Senate to stop legislation from being passed that you need 60 votes to overcome the other side's filibuster in order to get legislation passed. So if nobody is filibustering, then a majority is enough for legislation, but now we need 60 for almost everything because of how common filibustering is.
So instead of then, the idea of the filibuster is you have to get the support of the minority party.
Yeah.
Like that's the idea is you can't just dominate everybody if you have 51 Senate members. But then instead they do things like this, which is reconciliation bills. We can get into the details of later, but this is basically a bill that gets to bypass that. Okay, so some quick outlines of what's going on. This, as a quick history, passed the House of Representatives last week. That's why right now it's breaking news.
Live. They're debating it in the Senate. And
yes. So it has to be approved by the House of Representatives first. It passed by one vote. The vote was 215 to 214. So just barely passed. Several Republicans are not stoked about this. It's now going to the Senate. It needs to pass that. And then Trump is saying, yes, I love this. And he's the one calling it a big, beautiful bill. And then he'll pass it, right? So it's halfway through right now. It now needs to go to the Senate. In its current form, this is what we're looking at on spending, approximately. So primarily, this is going to cost a shitload of money because it's going to make all these tax cuts that happened in 2017 permanent. So if you want a simple takeaway from this, the main thing that is going to cause a bunch more of our debt to increase is because all these tax cuts that we did in 2017 during Trump's first office are set to expire at the end of this year. But this is going to make them permanent. As you can see, it's going to add about 3.8 trillion essentially lost revenue that we would have made.
And that's over the next 10 years?
Over the next 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So $3.8 trillion. There's also things like we're putting $144 billion into the Defense Department to upgrade the military, putting 67 into border security. So this is for building a wall.
Just because $144 billion additional dollars.
Yes,
Yeah.
on top of.
On
So
top
this
of
is
what it was already spent.
850 billion.
So
Which
this
isn't
is
that big, so it's, low-key they don't
right.
need it.
Yeah, if you are looking at the visual here, this is the change over 10 years of what we would have done otherwise, right? So this is 3.8 trillion more that we are going to be in the hole because we're losing all those tax revenues. This is a one-time 144 for the Defense Department to upgrade, modernize the military and all that, which has some merit, although we don't have a lot of money, and that's one of the areas we can get into. Bunch of money for border security, all this. So this
is, why can't you upgrade and modernize the military with the first 850 billion?
Yeah.
Why do you need an additional?
Many are asking.
Yeah.
Many are asking.
That's a lot of money to modernize the military. I don't think that's like the baseline. That's not like
that much money. Come on. Do you know how much it costs for a
144 billion.
soap
That's
dispenser?
that's like 2 more F-35s.
Right, it's not even like it's barely gonna get anything, dude. The one thing I like about it is they're like focusing on unmanned drones, which is I'm not a fan of unmanned drones, but that is where the military is going. So at some point you got to invest in that. But also $800 billion could probably cover a few drones.
That's what I'm saying. I think it's like when we want to do new stuff, we're like, well, we can't take the old stuff out.
Right. That's the
we can't
problem.
like cut our spending on tanks we're not using. We have to still buy those. Those have to
Well,
still
what
be
we
made.
can do is take
But
health care
what we
from
can-
poor people, which is what we'll get into next. So yeah, you might be wondering. So this slide, I think, is the main thing. This massively impactful bill. This is going to be the type of thing that Trump and the Republicans go, we fucking did it. We delivered. We got you those massive tax cuts permanent. We're adding to that. We're making the military stronger. We're making border security. This is basically it, right? They're spending trillions and trillions of dollars to tax people less in quotes. It's the amount that you're currently being taxed. It's not going up. More into the military, more into border security. But then they are making some cuts. So where are they cutting the spending? In theory, they should be cutting tons of spending because that's what the Republicans are supposed to do. That's like one of their core tenets: cut taxes, which they're doing,
Yeah,
and
small
cut spending.
government used to be the
Right. So they nailed one of the two, which is of their goals, right? Which is cut taxes. But ideally, you also cut spending, and so they are cutting spending primarily for Medicaid and welfare. So you can see on this chart for people who are listening, Medicaid, they're going to cut about $800 billion from Medicaid over the next 10 years. Medicaid, put very simply, is healthcare for poor, disabled folks in the community. There's two things that sound very similar. Medicare is for retired people.
old people.
Medicaid is for very, very poor people below a certain poverty level, or if they're disabled or whatnot.
I have a quick question about the Medicaid cuts. So my understanding is the way that this will work is they're employing new work requirements
Yes.
for people on Medicaid, which as a byproduct of that, a bunch of people who are currently on Medicaid will no longer have access to it. Is that the way that the savings happen?
Yes. So we can come back to this. But the short version, and they even have a little chart for it later. The short version is that Medicaid covers a certain number of people, and one of the key thresholds of whether you're eligible for Medicaid, where basically the government will pay for all your healthcare, is your income level. So if it's about 134% of the federal poverty limit. So I think it's like $20,000 right now. If you make $20,000 or less, then you're eligible for Medicaid. And what this is going to do is say, if you are single, you don't have dependents, and you're able to work, you need to be working. Otherwise, you're not eligible for Medicaid. So it's going to take a large chunk of people who technically are able to work. They're able-bodied. They're not taking care of other people. You now, if you're in that position, have to be working in order to be covered for this stuff. That alone is going to be saving $800 billion over 10 years, but it's also cutting millions of people from Medicaid. Like, the reason we're saving $800 billion is not because they're negotiating for drug prices.
Yeah.
It's because they're kicking people off of Medicaid. That is the gist of it.
Yeah.
So other things they're going to be...
That's insane.
Yeah. So that's one of the big ones I want to talk about. We can kind of get back to that. But, the reason that Democrats and many people are upset over the big, beautiful bill is because, again, we're doing all of this saving and reducing taxes for people, and the majority of it is coming from Medicaid and welfare.
So can we pull up a chart that I just sent, Perry? I've shown this before. I just think it's relevant. If you go back to your red one, and then we'll
The red one here, yeah.
relevant. It's just, just to be so specific on where these tax savings are going. It is not to poor people. It's not to or middle class people. They're getting some. Don't get me wrong. They're getting some.
Yeah.
But proportionally, it's
proportionally,
extremely,
the majority of the tax cuts are going to people that make. The biggest beneficiaries if you make over $914,000 a year, which is, LA podcasters and what it doesn't. It's a ridiculous. You can't put it any more stark than that. Than like, this is who's getting tax cuts, and the savings come from kicking people under 20 grand off healthcare. That's crazy, dude. I don't know. I feel like a caricature saying it, but it's like. How can that be explained any other way?
I remember being in a Valorant solo queue game a couple of years ago.
Wild.
And I promise this ties in.
Okay.
And it's pretty rare for politics to come up in that environment.
Sure.
But I think I said, I just said something in the game, and then one of my teammates said, I bet you're a Biden voter. and I was like, I did vote for him. Like, who did you vote for? And he's like, Trump all the way, baby, or something to that effect. And I was like, really? What's your problem with Biden, man? It's like, you don't want to, it's like Trump's cutting taxes for people like me. It's like, he's helping me, and I still think Biden should win. And I was like, he's doing bad things, man. This This is not working. That just reminded me of this conversation because the tax cuts are all heavily for the richest people. If you did not listen, Atriarch just put out a clip of the most recent Patreon episode we did on his channel, Public for Free, where we spent a bunch of time talking about, and more in the actual episode, talking about why cutting taxes for the wealthy has consequences, especially in the long term. And this is just continuing to further the problem. This is taking the tax cuts that we pushed through in 2017 during Trump's first term and making them permanent. They don't even have an expiration date anymore.
Yeah.
The tax cuts, again, looking at this, the huge takeaways from this bill are the Republicans are going to make these tax cuts permanent, which is going to cost us enormous amounts in revenue. And then most of where we're saving money, if at all, is through Medicaid and welfare. And also climate change and other things we can get into. So this started in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This was Trump's big legislation that he did, and it did three main things. One is it cut down individual tax rates. So you as an individual pay less in the United States for taxes now. But again, we'll talk about how it's kind of distorted towards rich people. The second is small businesses. So if you're a small business who has to put it, it's a pass-through business, but let's just say small business, you get a 20% reduction. So that was actually a deduction on federal taxes. So that's actually also a pretty big thing for small and medium-sized businesses. And then there was a corporate tax cut where they go from, I forget what it was.
I think it's down from 35 to 21.
Yeah. So something like that, like 35 to 21. And so there's this absolutely, 37 to 21. So the amount of taxes that a corporation paid was 37%. It goes down to 21%. That is massive. That is a huge, it's like billions of dollars in tax savings for major corporations.
If you look at that, so I looked this up last week in the wake of recording the last episode.
Sure.
Because we, in the main episode, we didn't talk much about raising taxes in the context of the national debt. And I think that was because I think we forget, because we talk to each other all the time, that we had talked to each other about that in the previous Patreon episode we recorded and then talked more about it after. But I don't want to ignore that part of dealing with debt, raising taxes.
Yes.
If you look at the corporate tax rate and the cut that we made in 2017 and the drop in revenue that happens, we cut down from I think $300 billion in 2016 to something like 200 or just over 200 billion the following year. When this tax cut goes into place. And then we follow those years with record corporate profits, right? So the number, even at 21%, does climb into the 400s and does, we do see record corporate tax revenue in America, even with that cut, because businesses grow so much during that period of time. But if the tax rate had still been 35%, you would be adding an extra 200 to $300 billion a year in tax revenue if the corporate tax rate had stayed at 35
What it
instead
was
of
in
21.
2015.
Yeah.
If you just account for the difference in percent and maybe not,
Right.
I don't know, shifts in
Yeah.
offsetting the tax.
Yeah.
Or
So there's
dodging
three
the tax.
huge categories that happened in 2017. The individual tax cuts, the small business tax cuts, the big corporate tax cuts. The big corporate ones are already permanent. That's not on the table here. So what we're talking about is just whether taxes would go back up for individuals and small and medium-sized businesses. I don't know why the fuck the corporate tax one was permanent and the other two, which might actually help people, don't understand that. That's crazy to me. But
that was one of the big criticisms the first time around when that legislation passed. The idea that the small business ones were going to expire and the giant corporate ones never will.
Yeah.
I did want to ask a question here, is when we talk about these cuts for small businesses versus the way that the corporate taxes work, if either of you know the answer to this, how do you gauge what is and isn't a small business of who gets to indulge in that tax cut? How is that actually judged? And
yeah, so in this case, it's just specifically the type of business. So if you are a corporation, a full-on C Corp in the United States, that's the corporate tax. If you are an LLC, S Corp, anything with pass-through. So for people who are not, we've all dealt with this. If you're a small business owner, even if you are if you're a freelancer, you are a sole proprietorship, which means it's pass through. If you make a small LLC to be a video editor or do a haircut salon or whatever, you're probably a small business where the money just passes through from the business to you. And so basically they're the same thing, to put it simply. Whereas if you get to a certain size, you make a proper corporation.
Yeah.
It's a fairly solid filter of like, if you're in a pass-through small business, you use these type of business structures, and otherwise you make a corporation, which is bigger, it has more taxes.
So you're saying if you're
more
a
complex.
one-man Uber driver or OnlyFans person, you should turn yourself into a corporation and not an S or not a LLC,
Making
corporations
your
have a bunch of extra taxes, but
so that you can avoid the taxes.
those are
Everyone should
corporations,
make
they
a
pay
C
double
corp.
tax, but
no.
but yeah, no, I mean, there's real cost to actually upping to a corporation. Although maybe people want to do that if this doesn't go through, because then their cost is jumping up. It's all very strange. So let me like finish the kind of overview of this, and we can dive into what's interesting or what,
Sure.
what we're
Yeah.
what we're feeling, because there's a lot here. So again, the main thing that this bill is doing, cutting a shitload of taxes, and which is going to cost us a ton of money, and then putting in extra money to Defense Department border. We are taking that money from not even that money. That is a bad way to phrase it. We're mildly compensating for how much money we're going to lose and spend by cutting a few
Yeah,
billion.
it's worth
a
these
few
are
trillion.
balanced. All this green does not add up. To
Right,
the
yeah, and that's what this first slide
yeah.
is. Like, to be clear, we are
Yeah.
not cutting enough to justify all the spending, and so we're cutting from all these various topics we can get into, and that is really the gist of it. I mean, we have some interesting things because we already mentioned it are not showing up. Yeah, like here's an example of I made a little calculation, a little code. If we want to calculate how much money you would save based on that 2017 thing, which actually it's already visual, so I don't need to bring out my laptop. But I'll just
This
leave
is how
on
much you'd save.
I'll leave on this. So imagine that you make, let's say at the bottom here, $50,000. The idea, your tax rates got cut, right, in 2017. That's the whole thing that we're talking about. So due to those tax cuts, if you made $50K, you would pay about $2,300 less in taxes. This is asterisk simplified. If you were to itemize and do all these other things, you get fancier. But you can see that if you make $10,000, the difference in that tax cuts and job act saves you about $360. If you make $50,000 a year, you save $2,000. It's not bad. If you make $100,000, you save about $4,000. Not bad. And you can see 200 and 500K, also several grand. But then if you make $1 million, you're getting back 20,000. And in fact, if you go even higher, if you make 5 million, your tax cuts are going to be 100. You're going to save $120,000. If you make 10 million a year, you're going to save $250,000. And so
We gotta thank God. Somebody has to ease the pressure on the eight
On the
digiters.
people that make $8 to $10 million. I agree.
So I think this is an interesting graph that is, again, if you're just listening, essentially these tax cuts, which are supposed to, the argument for tax cuts, right, is you stimulate the economy, you get more money into people's hands, they'll spend it, it'll stimulate everything, right?
Exactly, because you know what that 10 millionaire could use with that 250? He could all in on Sheeb, and then he makes maybe makes a big play off of that. You ever think about the stimulation?
The sheep simulation.
I want to be
Doge.
more stimulated by millionaires, and we need money in their pockets to do it. I think this is a very illustrative graph of these tax cuts that are supposed to help people. The primary benefit is going to come from being incredibly wealthy. And so there is a whole lot to do here. And there's even a crazy ass thing that they slipped into this bill, which again, the only way that this can be a reconciliation bill is it all has to be related to budget. So all of these things, they have to be like, this is related to our budget. That's why it has to be in this bill. One of the things they slipped in is that states cannot regulate AI for 10 years.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
So there is now if this
Just
goes
also,
through,
you can't.
if this goes through, there's a ban on regulating AI by the states, and it can only be done at the federal level for 10 years, which they say is budgetary because it's the federal government doesn't want to have to like oversee and the costs of what the state's regulation would do. That's a whole other crazy thing. So there's a lot to get in here, but this again right now, this is going to the Senate. The Senate right now, it's like split. So the Republicans have a slight majority. However, there are plenty of senators who are pissed about this. There's lots of people in general who are pissed about this. That analogy I started with, that was the Republican promise coming into this election, was like, we're going to cut spending. The Biden administration's been spending too much. The Democrats spend too much. We're going to cut this down. We're going to eliminate the deficit. We're going to make the debt. And they are doing the exact opposite. And so there are all these people, like I listened to All In this past week. That podcast is
It was
turned.
Ron Johnson, right?
They have become, like guests? Or?
He was a guest on all
At least not the one I just listened to a couple days ago. But they have really started leaning more and more right over the past year or two that I've been listening to them. They are like staunchly shocked by this and just be like, this is a betrayal of what was Elon Musk is upset. There's
Yeah, I
senators
wanted to
like
bring this up.
so now we can kind of dive into any of this. This is a crazy ass thing. This could have a huge impact on our debt, people's Medicare coverage, the whole principle of the importance of our debt and whether we even give a shit. It's all crazy.
It's interesting. I read an Elon